Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to see so many here tonight. I'm Colin Bailey, the Associate Director, and Peter J. Sharp, Chief Curator. And with Keith Christiansen's lecture this evening, we launch our summer series. We have two exhibitions, the Bellini in a new light that you will see this evening. The gallery will remain open until 7:30. We are also launching the Frick Mediateca, which you will see is a small room off the garden court. I encourage you to see both. And later in June, on June the 7th, we open an exhibition devoted to two wonderful console tables in the collection entitled Turkish Taste. There will be a series of lectures, therefore, this summer through to the end of June. Tonight, Keith introduces arguably the most beloved picture in the collection, and one that has undergone recently a fascinating technical and documentary examination by Charlotte Hale at the Met, Denise Allen, and Susanna Rutherglen, our Mellon Fellow. There are two more lectures on the St. Francis, but in a way, if I can call him this, the godfather to the whole project is Keith, who is, as you all know, John Pope Hennessy Chairman of the Department of European Paintings at the Met. He's worked at the Met for 33 years after completing a PhD from Harvard University in 1977. I think when we think of memorable, exquisitely chosen, published exhibitions in New York, we think of the projects that Keith has been involved in, from 15th century Siena to exhibitions devoted to Mantegna, Tiepolo, El Greco, Caravaggio, and Nicolas Poussin. He's written widely on Italian painting, has received several awards, is a member of several academies, and he's also taught at Columbia University and the Institute of Fine Arts in New York. Keith asked me to be brief, and as I said to him, if I gave you a sense of all of his accomplishments, I would take up far too much time. I would mention that, as well as being a scholar of the very first rank, he is also someone who writes for the general public, for the more general public, in articles that are extremely learned, articulate, and deeply moving. And I'm thinking of his recent series of articles for the New Republic. We are very lucky to have him tonight. He will talk on, his topic is finding our way into Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert. Please join me in welcoming Keith Christiansen.
Well, I need to get right into this because it's a long lecture, and been very preoccupied with this. It turned out I was reluctant to do the lecture in the first place because I had done an article in the New Republic, but I found that the more I got into it, the more material I had, and in the end I thought, oh my word, I've got 3 lectures here, and I've been cutting down. So I've urged everybody to bring pillows and a little bit of patience. But it's a real privilege to speak from the Frick. Now, as I said, I've been truly preoccupied by this talk, and not simply because I'm speaking from the podium of the Frick, which carries with it pretty high expectations on the part of you, the audience, but because the topic is one of the greatest paintings in the Renaissance. It's a work before which countless people have been moved, I think really enraptured by its vision of nature, and its inclusion of a figure, St. Francis, who seems, with his outstretched arms and upturned head, his open mouth, to be in a state of ecstasy. The green meadows and the distant hills, their slopes divided into fertile fields, their peaks crowned with castles and fortresses bathed in the soft, golden light of early morn, seem an affirmation of nature's benignity when lived in and cultivated. And this is made more poignant by the contrast with the barren rocks of the foreground, where St. Francis has created a rustic, simple, but well-appointed retreat and tends a garden of medicinal herbs. He has even managed to coax a grapevine to flourish over the beautifully carpentered desk where he reads and meditates. It was the quality of calmness that we find in this painting that Ruskin so admired. Few critics, I think, have described the unique achievement of Bellini as beautifully as Kenneth Clark in his classic 1949 book, Landscape into Art. As Bellini grew older, writes Kenneth Clark, he became more in love with the full light of day, in which all things can expand and be completely themselves. This is the feeling which pervades the picture of St. Francis now in the Frick collection. Here, at last, is a true illustration of St. Francis's hymn to the sun. No other great painting, perhaps, contains such a quantity of natural details, observed and rendered with incredible patience, for no other painter has been able to give to such an accumulation the unity which is only achieved through love. As the air fills everything and is not confined to one place, says Sebastian Frank, the 16th century mystic in his Paradoxa, as the light of the sun overflows the whole earth, is not the earth, and yet makes all things on earth verdant, so God dwells in the everything, and everything dwells in him. Well, in an essay I wrote for the New Republic a couple of years ago, I compared Bellini's vision of nature to that of Wordsworth in his great poem, Tintern Abbey. I did not mean by that to ignore the important relation his art has with the religious poetry of the day, something Clarke evokes, and to which I'll return in this lecture. Nor did I mean to underplay the fascinating fact that Bellini painted the St. Francis at the very moment that pastoral poetry achieved a new status and complexity. Italian poets were revisiting and translating into the vernacular the classical eclogue, not only those of Virgil, but of lesser poets too. At the court of Ferrara, the aristocratic poet Matteo Boiardo, the author of the hugely successful chivalric epic Orlando in Love, was composing Petrarchan love poems in which the beauty of nature provides a refuge and sometimes a counterpoint to the restless soul of the forlorn lover. Here's an example, which I'm quoting from a prose translation. Now the shepherdess leads the white troop that is in her keeping down to the plain, for she sees the sun declining and the hour late, and the high country houses sending up their smoke in the distance. The bent plowman lifts himself straight and tall and looks about at the day that flees and frees his oxen from the yoke, that he may not be late in returning to his rest. And I alone, without any refuge, have no respite from my thoughts with the sun, and come to sigh again with the stars. Sweet unrest of love, how mild you are, for I rest neither by day nor by night. Poems such as this one offer a highbrow analog to Bellini's descriptive brush, but we shouldn't press the analogy too far, because the terms of Boiardo's poem make us think less of Bellini's landscape than the backgrounds of various paintings by Titian, for example, the background of the Sacred and Profane Love, which you see on the screen. And indeed, there is a substantial literature on the relation of Titian's pastoral landscapes to Jacopo Sanazzaro's vastly popular poem, Arcadia, in which the lovelorn narrator wanders the countryside, listening to the amorous and mournful songs of shepherds he meets. The poem was written in Naples, but a pirated edition appeared in Venice in 1502, and parts of the poem had been circulating in manuscript for more than a decade. I think it is precisely by comparison with this pastoral tradition, both in its literary and in its visual manifestations, that we recognize the very different character of Bellini's landscapes. For rather than relating to the poetic fiction of a fairy tale Arcadia, populated with lovelorn shepherds and nymphs, Bellini conjures up a nature that seems hauntingly familiar and real, the landscape of the Veneto, which he had ample occasion to study when he retired to his villa, and in which he seems to identify the presence of God. It's my task today not to situate Bellini's landscape vision within a poetics of Western landscape, as Kenneth Clarke set out to do, but to locate it within Bellini's own career, and to attempt to define what I think it was he was trying to do. Of course, there's an extensive literature on the subject, most of which I will ignore, for the simple reason that when I'm standing before this great painting at the Frick, most of it seems curiously irrelevant. One soon loses oneself in reflection, memory, and associations. Of course, most of those associations are different from those of Bellini's contemporaries, and that's the problem. But I don't want to dispel the aura that Bellini casts, the way, as with the greatest poetry, he seems to uncover basic truths in the ordinary. It's because of this that I've become wary of any interpretive approach to the picture that espouses the methods of exegesis or attempts to decipher in detail purported symbols embedded within the landscape, as though the treatment of the theme, which we have still to identify, could be solved through the identification of a specific literary text or the richness of the landscape decoded like some erudite rebus. It's a rule of scholarship that we tend to find in works of art what we expect to find, that intellectual argument often proceeds from an assumed point of departure. So I need to say that my point of departure is the very strong impression I have that the novelty of Bellini's picture lies in the way it rejects a canonical, iconographic treatment of the theme in favor precisely of a more open-ended, associative, and poetic approach, and that this was made possible by the relatively new phenomenon of pictures painted for private delectation rather than to decorate a chapel or church. But of course, there was a theme, and there was a patron, and we will have to discuss both. We will also need to consider, however speculatively, how we think Bellini expected his viewers to look at and engage with the picture's poetics. So I'm going, very timidly I confess, to attempt to take you through the way, at this particular point of time, I see the matter, deeply mindful of Robert Frost's famous injunction, poetry is what gets lost in translation. It is also what is lost in interpretation. Before beginning, it might be useful to note some of the reasons the task before us is so difficult. In the first place, we know remarkably little about the artist. Bellini, the man, is more or less a cipher. Even the matter of when he was born or whether he was illegitimate or not remains a matter of dispute. For the record, I believe he was born sometime between 1435 and 1440, which means he would have been almost 40 when he painted the Frick picture, which is almost universally dated to about 1480. And he was the illegitimate son of Jacopo Bellini, and thus the half-brother of Gentile Bellini. It's a remarkable fact, but we actually possess not a single contract for a major altarpiece by Bellini, and we know next to nothing about the circumstances surrounding the creation of this particular picture. The basic information we have regarding its history was pieced together in an exemplary article by Jennifer Fletcher in 1972. She was forced to leave open some blanks, which have now been filled in, so that we can pretty much trace the picture from the time it was in the collection of Taddeo Contarini in Venice in 1525 to its purchase by Henry Clay Frick in 1916. As will become apparent, this information on the picture's history brings into play some important written descriptions. Additionally, a thorough technical examination, as you've all heard, was undertaken at the Metropolitan Museum last spring in an effort to solve the vexing question of whether the red marks one sees on Francis's hands are original or not, whether he is shown with the stigmata, and how much of the picture was cut at the top. That it was trimmed at the top has been known for a very long time. Now, these may seem like minor points, but much of the literature on the picture concerns whether the event Bellini shows is the stigmatization of St. Francis. If he followed canonical practice, then he should show the stigmata on the saint's body and a seraph in the form of Christ on the cross hovering in the sky. Let me deal with the technical information first. A careful microscopic examination of the hands and the extended foot of the saint have demonstrated that, yes, the stigmata one sees on the hands is original. In the foot are microscopic traces of paint where the stigmata seems also to have been shown, but is no longer visible. And I think those traces are right up in this area. There was never anything in the side, where usually the habit of the saint is open and we can see a wound, as in this depiction of the subject by Bellini in the predella of his altarpiece in Pesaro. The presence of the stigmata does not necessarily mean that the subject of the painting is the stigmata, only that the saint is shown with the signs of his particular identity with Christ. What about the trimming of the panel? The original vertical and bottom edges are intact, and there is an unpainted edge that would have been covered by the frame. And this is the unpainted edge, which you can see does not exist at the top. At the top, the paint surface has been cut. How much? Well, with X-rays, it's possible to make out nail heads denoting where vertical pieces of wood were originally attached as additional support to the panel. These vertical pieces are called battens. The spacing of these nails from the edges of the panel strongly suggests that we are missing very little indeed. The nails are actually closer to the bottom edge of the panel, which has not been cut, than they are to the top edge, which has. But the paint surface has been cut, and we are missing something. I must say I find this all very confusing. As my colleague Charlotte Hale remarked to me, we know that much more, but it's still inconclusive. I thought that was such a marvelous line. It sums up so much in life. Yet such deliberate cutting must have had a motivation. Was it the elimination of damage to the upper edge of the panel? Was it to modify the dimensions to balance another picture? Or was it the offending presence of a very small serif up there in the left corner where everyone has recognized that something very particular is happening, since we see miraculous rays of light emerging between the clouds and extending into the open space of the tree, which seems to be bending in response. On this point, I must insist. These are miraculous rays of light. Indeed, the only place I know of where we find somewhat similar rays is in his great altarpiece of the Transfiguration, which was painted about the same time as the St. Francis, but as an altarpiece for a chapel in the Cathedral of Vicenza. Here again, we are dealing with miraculous rays, and I'm sorry, I took this photograph in the dim light of Capodimonte a couple years ago in anticipation of this lecture, and these are really very striking rays of light in the original, but in the darkened room with the camera, they don't look that brilliant. These are in accordance with the Gospel account. Behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud. Bellini never shows rays when he's simply showing ordinary illumination. Now, X-rays reveal that in the St. Francis, Bellini had second thoughts about his treatment of the tree. The reserve area allowed for less foliage, and had he not painted additional leaves over the sky, the bend in the tree would have appeared more emphatic. Perhaps the effect seemed too unnatural to him. And incidentally, these are the signs of the nail holes from that vertical batten. 2 up here, 1 here. All one can say is that the ambiguous results of the technical examination are echoed in the 2 quite different descriptions of the picture that have come down to us from the 16th and from the 17th centuries, to which I will refer shortly. I was curious whether some further hints might be gleaned from a comparison of the sizes of other pictures painted by Bellini at precisely this time. Now, unfortunately, I have only the published dimensions, which may or may not be absolutely accurate. That said, have a look at this group of 4 pictures, all dating from the years around 1480. I've divided them into 2 pairs. The first shows the Frick St. Francis with the Resurrection of Christ in Berlin, that was painted as an altarpiece for San Michele in Isola in Venice. Take a look at the dimensions. And here's the second pair, which is the Transfiguration in Naples that we've seen was painted for the cathedral in Vicenza, and the St. Jerome in Florence, which was possibly an altarpiece painted for Santa Maria dei Miracoli in Venice. Once again, take a look at their dimensions. I don't think the similarity in size can be coincidental. In each case, we have a pair of same-size panels, one oriented horizontally, the other vertically. Now, in the 15th century, there was a tendency towards similarly proportioned and sized panels for altarpieces. It greatly facilitated production and framing. So it would not surprise me to learn that Bellini ordered several same-sized panels from a carpenter and had them on hand to fulfill commissions. In any event, if this information has any validity, it suggests that the Frick panel may be missing upwards of 4 or 5 centimeters at the top. So throw that into the hopper of inconclusive evidence. Now for the history of the picture and the 2 most important descriptions of it. The year is 1525, about 45 years after Bellini painted the St. Francis and 9 years after his death. The occasion was a visit to the collection in Venice of Taddeo Contarini by one of the great connoisseurs of the day, Marcantonio Michiel. Born into an old Venetian family, but blocked from high political office because of an indiscretion, he had assaulted his cousin to gain possession of a deed box. Marcantonio Michiel enjoyed a wide circle of friends. He was intellectually curious, he had literary ambitions, and he was well known in Venetian circles for his expertise on art. During the time he spent in Rome, he started keeping notes on the things he saw. "For my own use and memory, and not for anyone else," he wrote a friend. Despite this disclaimer, he evidently contemplated writing commentaries on various artists, but like his projected History of Venice, nothing came of the scheme. He was an indefatigable visitor to churches and private collections, and fortunately for us, some of the notes he made on the works of art that impressed him survive. Since in Venice, unlike in Florence, we possess very few documents that relate to works of art, Michiel's notes are fundamental to our knowledge of Venetian painting. Without them, we would know nothing about the painter-illuminator Giacometto, and would be poorly informed indeed about what Giorgione painted. So his visit to the collection of Taddeo Contarini and the notes he took on the major works he saw there are of exceptional importance. Now, Taddeo was born in 1466, and he was thus almost 20 years older than Michiel. He would have been in his mid-teens when the St. Francis was painted. He had a humanist education and made his considerable fortune in maritime commerce and real estate. From Michiel's notes and from an inventory of the Contarini collection drawn up in 1556, Taddeo emerges as one of the key patrons of Giorgione. There, in the long hall of his palace, hung three major works by the artist, including the so-called Three Philosophers, now in Vienna. There were three paintings by Bellini, a portrait of a woman, Christ bearing the cross, and the St. Francis, as well as two by Palmavecchio, including his famous Three Women, now in Dresden, and a portrait of Bianca Maria Sforza, the second wife of Emperor Maximilian. It's by a Milanese artist. And there was also a large canvas showing horses by the Lombard painter Romanino. It might seem to us a curious mixture of sacred and profane works, but we should not be too surprised at this sort of mixing up, since by this date works of art were as likely to be collected for their authors and quality as for the subjects they treated. Not every picture with a religious theme ended up in a bedroom or a private oratory or on the altar of a church, and this, I believe, is a crucial factor in considering the St. Francis. It's also important to get a feeling for what interested Michiel in his descriptions. If the subject was straightforward and readily identifiable, he names it. But precisely because his notes were in the form of an aide-memoire, he made a point of putting a name to what he saw and noting outstanding compositional features. For example, concerning Giorgione's Three Philosophers, the subject of which is anything but self-evident, he wrote, "The canvas done in oil of the three philosophers in a landscape, two standing and one sitting, who contemplates the rays of the sun, with the rock so marvelously done. It was begun by Giorgione da Castelfranco and finished by Sebastiano del Piombo." Not only does his description make it possible for us to identify the work with absolute certainty, it gives us an idea of the way an educated art lover looked at this extraordinary but puzzling picture, reading the visual clues and admiring the descriptive character of the work without being able to discern a specific subject. Landscape was one of the things he was meticulous about recording. Another was authorship, and frequently he was the one who proposed the attribution. Also the past history of an object when it was known or of interest. Concerning 4 pages of an exquisite book of hours, illuminated, he says, most subtly and perfectly in the hand of Giacometto, he records, "They passed through the hands of various dealers for some time, but in the first place were done for Messire Zuan, that is Giovanni Michiel, and always valued at least at 40 ducats. How does he describe the Frick picture? The painting of St. Francis in the wilderness, in oil, is the work of Giovanni Bellini, begun by him for Messire Juan Michiel. That's the same man who owned the Book of Hours by Giacometto. And it has a landscape, minutely finished and marvelously studied. It's a disarmingly straightforward description that lays the emphasis on the novelty of the landscape rather than on the possible action of the figure. Indeed, Michiel would seem to have been as remarkably untroubled by the image as I imagine most visitors to the Frick are today. As you might imagine, this passage has been parsed by every scholar who has written on the painting, so it's important to remember that we are dealing with casual notes intended only as an aide-memoire. Michiel never expected they would be read by others, and certainly would be astonished to find each word painstakingly analyzed for possible hints about the subject and function of the painting. The Italian term Michiel uses to describe the setting is deserto, San Francesco nel deserto. This has sometimes been treated as though it had some iconographic significance, but the meaning of the word is really entirely too generic to support this. It simply means wilderness. And that's surely all Michiel intended when he employed it. What about his note, cominciato da lui a Messier Juan Michiel, that is, begun by Bellini for Messier Giovanni Michiel? I think we'd be well advised to stick to the most straightforward sense, that the work was not painted for Taddeo Contarini, who then owned it, but had been commissioned by Giovanni Michiel, that is, that although begun for Giovanni Michiel, it was acquired by Contarini, which actually is not that surprising, since Taddeo Contarini is known to have commissioned by himself from Bellini a St. Jerome in the Wilderness, also described by another key source on Venetian painting as nel deserto, for a chapel in the Franciscan Church of Santa Maria dei Miracoli. That Contarini owned two wilderness paintings, if I may be permitted to refer to them as such, I find very noteworthy. The St. Jerome in the Wilderness is often, if inconclusively, identified with the marvelous picture in the Uffizi that you see on the screen, one of whose dimensions we have already looked at. And it is usually dated to the time of the St. Francis, around 1480-82, and this creates a problem if Contarini really is the patron, because the church was only completed in 1489. But what seems to me important is that it is the kind of work that, in its emphasis on landscape and its richly varied description of nature, would have very much appealed to a connoisseur such as Taddeo Contarini. What we have in the St. Jerome and the St. Francis are paintings that lay out a new approach to devotional painting. Their terms are suggestive rather than symbolic. They are a kind of sacred poesia, the precondition for Titian's great mythological poesie, in which the emphasis shifts from the canonical depiction of a subject to artistic invention and elaboration. Bellini's approach was embraced by a generation of Venetian artists, as is evident from this painting of St. Jerome in the Wilderness by Cima da Conegliano, and you can see it's obviously based on the Frick St. Francis. This broader, more open approach to subject matter or themes is the outgrowth of an analogy of painting to poetry, much commented upon in the Renaissance. We know that this approach was embraced by Bellini because of his correspondence with Isabella d'Este, the Marchese of Mantua. Unhappy with the complex iconographic program she tried to harness him to, he proposed painting instead a fairly conventional subject, the Madonna and Child with St. John the Baptist, that would, however, include what he calls distant views and other fantasies. The distant views were, quite obviously, what would make the picture special. Despite initial disappointment at the rejection of her project, Isabella was very pleased with the result once the painting was delivered. 2 years later, in 1506, she asked the poet Pietro Bembo to help her with another commission. Bellini was habitually behind a schedule. He informed her that there was no point in strapping Bellini with a fixed iconographic program, which was inimical to his manner of working. The subject would have to be accommodated to his fantasy, since, Bembo writes, it is his practice, as he says, to wander at will in his paintings, so that in a like fashion they satisfy those who look at them. This was written 25 years after the St. Francis was painted, but I think it is nonetheless relevant to understanding the poetics of the picture and the manner in which he expected viewers to engage with them. It also reminds us that from about 1480 on, Bellini even introduces landscape into his altarpieces, despite their interior setting. You see these marvelous strips at the sides of his altarpieces. Although a generation separates Bellini's St. Francis from Giorgione's Three Philosophers, they seem to me profoundly similar in the way, in each, the ostensible subject provided the artist with a point of departure for thematic elaboration. Is it pure coincidence that the Three Philosophers is also virtually the same size as the St. Francis? When Contarini commissioned the picture from Giorgione, might he have had in mind to hang it as a pendant to the St. Francis? Two pictures, one sacred, one profane, both with landscapes and both animated by light. In one case miraculous, and the other case the sun's rays. Of course, this is mere speculation. What I really want to emphasize is the exceeding unlikelihood that the Frick painting could have been conceived as an altarpiece. I only bring this up because the hypothesis has been floated that the picture may have some connection with the church of San Francesco del Deserto, situated on an island in the Venetian lagoon, where St. Francis was said to have taken refuge in 1220. In the 13th century, the property belonged to a member of the Michiel family, who gave it to the Franciscans in 1228. An oratory was built, and this much-neglected structure was restored in the years after 1453. In 1466, the chapel was rededicated to the stigmatization of St. Francis. And in 1480, about the time Bellini painted the Frick's picture, the Reformed Franciscans, the Observants, held their provincial chapter meeting on the island, attended by that gifted preacher and fanatic anti-Semite, Fra Bernardino da Feltre. However pertinent these events may seem at first glance as a context for the commission of Bellini's picture, we have to remind ourselves that there is absolutely no evidence that Giovanni Michiel, the person who commissioned the picture, had any special association with that church, whether indeed he even descended from the same branch of the family as had owned the property 2.5 centuries earlier. Michiel, it appears, was a fairly common name in Venice. What we can say for certain is that his name occurs in none of the 15th century documents associated with the repair and remodeling of the church and its new dedication. In any event, I feel absolutely confident that had the commission originated as an altarpiece, we would have a canonical depiction of St. Francis receiving the stigmata, much as Bellini painted in the predella of his great altarpiece, the Coronation of the Virgin in Pesaro, and the detail we're going to look at that predella, which I showed you once before. There, St. Francis is shown kneeling, his hands outstretched to receive the stigmata from a minuscule seraph of Christ on the cross. You may not see it at first glance, for he's much smaller than was the norm. Francis is attended by Brother Leo, in accordance with the Franciscan literary sources. The one anachronistic feature in that work is that instead of showing a small chapel on Mount Laverna, as was the norm, Bellini shows the monumental Gothic apse of the Church of San Giovanni e Paolo, the chief Dominican church in Venice. He obviously thought the Franciscans in Pesaro would not notice the interpolation of a building belonging to their rival order. But the inclusion serves as an important warning against reading too much symbolic meaning into the architecture Bellini includes in his landscapes. Now, Santi Giovanni e Paolo was a church Bellini knew well. He was indeed buried there. He must have passed by it frequently, since he lived in the area and belonged to the lay confraternity, the Scuola Grande di San Marco, at its side. As it turns out, Giovanni Michiel, the person who commissioned the Frick painting, was not simply a member of that same confraternity, but was elected to its highest office, the Grand Guardian. His admiration for Bellini is probably reflected in the writings of his brother, who wrote burlesque and satirical poems. In one, Andrea Michiel, known as Sguarzola, praises, I quote, the sublime and excellent hand of Giovanni Bellini. And in another, he has a badly painted crucifix lament that he was not painted by Bellini, in which case the image declares he would have turned out much more human and divine. Did Sguarzola possibly have a picture such as this extraordinary devotional painting of Christ crucified in mind? It's known as the Niccolini crucifixion, and I'll return to it later, since it incorporates a landscape almost as rich as that in the St. Francis. As pointed out by Sguarzola, it is precisely the mixture of the sacred and the human that stands behind Bellini's achievement. What Henry James so marvelously characterized as a richness of sanctity that is almost profane. As I will try to show, to arrive at this particular quality, Bellini may have drawn upon popular devotional poetry in the form of canticles and laudi, or hymns, that were sung at these confraternities. But before I get to these, I want to turn for us to the second important description of the painting that has come down to us. It occurs in the writings of the 17th century Venetian author Marco Boschini, and it has befuddled scholars for a long time, since at first read it seems so far removed from the painting in the Frick. It was indeed long denied by scholars that the passage could have any relevance to the Frick painting. However, thanks to the tenacious work of a young scholar who managed to fill in the holes in the provenance, we now know that the picture Marcantonio Michiel described in the collection of Taddeo Contarini was inherited by Giovanni Giustinian, whose mother was a Contarini, and it was in the collection of Giovanni Giustinian's son, Giulio, that Marco Boschini saw the picture. Here's his description, which, like the rest of his book, is in verse. Giovanni Bellini here represents the seraphic Father, full of divine zeal, and Christ who appears from the heavens in the shape of a fiery seraphim. Certainly, whoever sees that ardent love, and here I am stealing a pertinent verse, will say, Francis by Christ is wounded hand to hand, foot to foot, breast to breast. That eminent Mount Laverna seems to me as natural as when described by the great Maffeo Venier, that excellent Venetian poet. What in heaven's name is going on here? In 1584, the Venetian poet Maffeo Venier had composed a densely descriptive poem about St. Francis receiving the stigmata on Mount Laverna. And it's from this work that Boschini takes his lines. Interestingly for us, Boschini had no doubt what event from the life of St. Francis Bellini had shown, and he asserts that there was, indeed, a figure of a seraphic Christ in the sky. But after saying this, he shifts his focus from what the picture shows, or what he thought it showed, to its effect on the viewer. And to make this transition clear, he quotes directly from Venier's poem. Scholars have gotten hung up on the style of Boschini's poem, which is unquestionably Baroque, and they have found it inapplicable to Bellini's painting. They're wrong. Boschini does not say that in the picture Francis is shown wounded by the seraph hand to hand, foot to foot, and so on. He says that anyone who sees such a display of vivid suffering or love will, in the words of the poet Venier, declare that Francis is wounded by Christ. And moreover, that the landscape is as naturalistic as that described in Venier's poem. Just as in reading Marcantonio Michiel, we have to remember that he was jotting down informal notes to himself, so in reading Boschini, we must recall that he was attempting, through the employment of the reigning poetic conventions, to inspire in his reader an emotional response. Moreover, when we turn to Maffeo Venier's richly descriptive poem, we can see why, in looking at Bellini's masterpiece, this came to mind. Here's part of a stanza from Venier. Here you see valleys eminent and deep, and impenetrable caverns, broken stones hanging overhead with frozen, barren trees of great height. The saintly man chose this inhospitable landscape to be with God. Venier's poem and Boschini's description are the products of that tradition that we can trace to Horace's much-read treatise, The Art of Poetry, in which the first century BC poet famously declared, a poem is like a picture, ut pictura poesis. The idea was taken up by virtually every humanist writer of the 15th and 16th century. Indeed, in the course of the 15th century, it became common practice to compose a descriptive poem, an ekphrasis, that painted a picture with words, thereby demonstrating the superiority of poetry to painting. It's what Venier's poem attempts to do. Since Bellini's St. Francis has its roots in this convention, it's worth reviewing the steps leading up to his supreme achievement. In his classic study on humanist critics, written 40 years ago, Michael Baxendale gave as a prime example of this ekphrastic tradition the praise the great humanist Guarino of Verona had for the works of Pisanello. He wasn't describing this picture. I'm going to read to you his description, which is of nothing that has come down to us by Pisanello, but it applies to this. It applies to, in general way, to Pisanello's approach to painting. You equal nature's works, whether you are depicting birds or beasts, perilous straits and calm seas. We would swear we saw the spray gleaming and heard the breakers roar. I put out a hand to wipe the sweat from the brow of the laboring peasant. We seemed to hear the whinny of a war horse and the tremble at the blare of trumpets. When you paint a nocturnal scene, you make the night birds flit about, and not one of the birds of the day is to be seen. If you set the action in spring, varied flowers smile in the green meadows, the old brilliance returns to the trees, and the hills bloom. Here the air quivers with the songs of birds. Baxendale saw how pertinent this sort of aesthetic, emphasizing variety, naturalistic effects, and expressivity was for understanding the background of Pisanello's fresco of St. George and the Dragon, with its astonishingly rendered animals, courtly figures, mustached Mongols in the background, the sea with the boat and the spray at its bow, and the city and the executed criminals hanging from the gallows. As if these details are not enough, we should remember that the sky was originally blue and there was a prominent rainbow, thrown in for good measure, as though the idea was to outdo Guarino's shopping list of qualities. Almost all of these details are extraneous to the story. They were included as cues for a sophisticated, humanist-trained audience, and they called attention to Pisanello's stature as an artist, someone able to vie with them in matters of description. A drawing such as this one in the upper left reminds us of the studies from nature that stand behind Pisanello's work, and that Bellini, too, must have made in preparation for the birds he includes in his paintings, such as the little kingfisher near the spigot in the St. Francis. This little bird has, incidentally, been persistently incorrectly identified as a bittern in a number of studies of the picture, and I put this image of a kingfisher so that you can see that is where it is. And of course, he's put exactly where a kingfisher would be, right where a spigot of water comes out in the cool rocks. Guarino came from Verona, but he taught in Ferrara. And it was for the enlightened ruler of Ferrara, Leonello d'Este, that around 1440, Giovanni Bellini's father, Jacopo, painted this remarkable little painting, showing a diminutive figure of the young Marquis kneeling before the Madonna and Child, who are shown in a deep landscape, a bit less rich in detail than Pisanello's fresco, but far more convincing. The Virgin and two deer, one resting by her side, the other grazing, are shown enclosed by small trees, a reference to the enclosed garden of medieval art. But once we move beyond the enclosure, we see to one side horsemen charging past the walls of a city and the cell of a hermit towards a distant town. On the other is a farm building with a peasant, a protected beehive, and beyond a city from which a rider emerges. Here's the man on horseback coming out of the gates of the city. The horizon is marked by a range of mountains colored by the light of the rising sun. It's been remarked that the picture is conspicuously programmed to challenge the view Leonello is said to have expressed that painters could not portray things like the colors of dawn or the setting sun, that indeed the genius of writers was beyond the reach of painters. Jacopo offered the humanist writers at the Este court a formidable challenge, and for those of you who know the picture, it's this big. There can be no question that Jacopo Bellini's example provided Giovanni with a firm starting point. But even more important was that of his brother-in-law, Andrea Mantegna. Let us take the predella of his great altarpiece for the Benedictine monastery of San Zeno in Verona. Commissioned in 1456 by its humanist-trained abbot, Gregorio Carrere, the altarpiece was painted in Padua, where Bellini certainly had occasion to study it. Simply in terms of naturalistic description, this work set new standards, whether in the rendition of the evening sky, the great curve of the hill, or the rippled surface of the river. It's quite extraordinary, that. But it was Mantegna's innovation to use his mastery of a minutely descriptive style to confer a quality of historical moment and authenticity on the event he depicts. To achieve this, he refracted the landscape of the Veneto through the lens of classical literary sources. Flavius Josephus's Jewish War, written in the 1st century, and Eusebius's 4th century dictionary of place names in sacred history, the Onomasticon. His depiction of Jerusalem in the background, dominated by an enormous circular temple, is based on these, as is the depiction of the valley of Jehoshaphat, traversed by a stream fed by the fountain of Siloam in the cleavage of the rocks, and the desolate Mount of Olives, where an orchard has been laid waste. And here, of course, is the fountain of Siloam. When Gregorio Carrere examined the altarpiece, he must have taken enormous pleasure in the historical and antiquarian verisimilitude Mantegna had managed to confer on the scene. These gave added weight to the many details that served as meditational prompts for the informed. For example, the tree stumps would have recalled to many viewers the well-known lines from the Gospel of St. Luke, "Now also is the axe laid unto the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, which bringeth forth not good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire." To a humanist educated person, such as Carrere, the swarms of bees buzzing around the hives may have recalled St. Augustine's commentary on Psalm 118, where the verse, "They compassed me about like bees," is interpreted as an allusion to the capture of Christ. Or they might have been linked in Carrere's mind to Virgil's description of the keeping of bees. Of course, the picture could be appreciated by anyone simply as a dramatic narration. But if, like Gregorio Carrere, you had the proper literary training, and we happen to know that, like most humanists, he was fond of Augustine, you found a great deal more to admire and think about. In other words, it is a picture that operates simultaneously on different levels depending upon what the viewer brings to it. That Bellini was less intellectually inclined than his brother-in-law is clear from his Agony in the Garden, which lacks precisely the kind of historicism and exegetical reference Mantegna included. But Bellini, too, could, on occasion, respond to patrons with special interests. Take, for example, the Niccolini Crucifixion, with its deeply affecting image of the crucified Christ, shown in a barren area littered with skulls, behind which we see a Jewish cemetery with tombstones inscribed in Hebrew. Dates have actually been read on them. Unusually, the titulus is written in quite accurate Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, as recorded in the Gospels, obviously at the request of the patron. There are some conventional symbols. The tree on the right is barren, but the one in which a white dove is perched shows signs of life, and the laurel at the left has sent out fresh shoots, symbol of victory of life over death. What is novel is the inclusion of the cemetery and the winding path that leads past farm buildings and a mill to a prosperous city. And there, of course, is the mill with the millstone outside. Bellini must have been asked to base his depiction on Jerome's commentary of the Gospel of St. Matthew, in which the 4th century author of the Vulgate noted, "I have heard that someone has explained that the place of the skull is the place where Adam is buried. This interpretation is attractive and soothing to the ear of the people, but it is not true. For outside the city and outside the gate, there are places in which the heads of the condemned are cut off. This is where they took the name of the skull, Calvary. That is, it refers to the skulls of the decapitated." Jerome then explains, "Christ is crucified as a guilty man among the guilty for the salvation of all." Now, Jerome was a favored saint of humanists. His commentary explains the numerous skulls in Bellini's picture, arranged like a macabre memento mori. But the passage I have read from his commentaries provided merely a point of departure for the creation of a deeply effective meditation. To a contemporary Venetian, the abandoned Jewish cemetery would have called to mind the one on the Lido that dates back to 1386. Well, what should be Jerusalem has the appearance of a contemporary Italian city. It even includes buildings based on known structures. The Church of San Ciriaco of Ancona, and I hope you can all make out the resemblance of these two churches, the Tower of Santa Fosca in Venice, and the facade of the Cathedral of Vicenza. Here it is in a 16th century woodblock. Bellini jettisoned a Mantegnesque idea of historical verisimilitude. In conformity with a recommended strategy of devotional practice, the viewer is encouraged to make an imaginary pilgrimage from a lived-in 15th century present to the site of Christ's crucifixion, isolated in both space and time. In the contrast he sets up between the desolation of the foreground and the lushness of the background and the winding path that takes us from the one to the other, Bellini maps out a journey or a pilgrimage of the soul. In a sermon on the Gospel of St. Mark, St. Augustine urged his listeners to follow Christ. "The road is exceedingly rough," he writes, It makes you very reluctant. You don't want to follow all the same. We find the same sentiments in a 15th century hymn or laud. Flee, O Christians, this profane love, and instead follow now the Redeemer. Follow good and true Jesus, who on the cross wished to die for us, who with his open arms and loud voice proclaimed that he wished us to follow. I cannot resist here noting that the devotional and meditational approach that Bellini espouses in this extraordinary picture was taken up by the greatest master of what I call the maniera devota of the next century, Federico Barocci. His astonishing Christ crucified in the Prado seems almost an update of Bellini's. The figure of Christ on the cross is wedged between the frame and the picture space, his loincloth animated by a mystic wind. Behind him a path descends into the city, not Jerusalem, but Urbino. Barocci actually lived in the area just to the left of the house rooftops you see. Christ is shown alive, uttering his last words before his death, when we are told in the gospel, there was darkness over all the land. Across the depression all visitors to Urbino are familiar with rises the ducal palace. And we see that some of the rooms are lit. Life is going on. Just as in the distance, all seems peaceful. We are invited to reflect on the moment depicted and its temporal incongruities, an intersection of past and present in the mind of the viewer. I confess I never go to the Prado without standing in front of this picture. It simply blows my mind the way he's created this. And it is, in a real sense, of great testimony to what Bellini achieved in his devotional pictures. There is, it seems to me, a deep affinity, both in style and programmatic strategy, between the Niccolini crucifixion and the Frick St. Francis. And for that reason, I would like now to return to that picture to point out the ways in which Bellini provided Giovanni Michiel and Taddeo Contarini with a deeply meditative image, the character of which derives as much from the relationship of painting to poetry and to contemporary devotional practices as it does from any complex iconographic program. But before doing this, we need very briefly to note how during the 1470s, Bellini moved from a somewhat schematic vision of nature, predicated on the example of his great brother-in-law, Mantegna, and on Netherlandish painting, to one based on his own deeply personal engagement with the landscape of the Veneto. Bellini was one of those artists, Raphael was another, who was impelled forward by contact with the work of other artists. In February 1471, there arrived in Venice an astonishing little picture, a stigmatization of St. Francis painted by Jan van Eyck. It belonged to the Genoese merchant Anselmo Adorno, who was making a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Fortunately, he maintained a journal, which makes it possible to trace his footsteps. The picture he carried with him for his private devotions elicited enormous admiration in Italy for its truly astonishing representational technique. In Florence, the background was copied in a work by Botticelli, and it's very hard to make this out in this blown-out thing, but it even includes a city, the boat in the water, as well as the rock formation. Bellini, too, had occasion to study the picture, and we recognize its importance immediately if we compare the rock formations to those in his St. Jerome in the Wilderness. Van Eyck set up a contrast between the rocky escarpment and a distant view with a river port, and this contrast, as well as the microcosmic vista, unquestionably struck a sympathetic chord with Bellini. The second event was the arrival in Venice in 1475 of the Sicilian painter Antonello da Messina. In Naples, Antonello had already mastered an Eyckian style, and his work served as a catalyst for that of Bellini. In 1475, Antonello painted this crucifixion with a distant landscape vista. It opened to Bellini new possibilities and led him to leave behind both Mantegna's minute but somewhat dry, cerebral style and the minutely descriptive style of Netherlandish painting in favor of a new truth of tone and atmosphere based on his personal experience of nature. We see this quite clearly in a devotional painting in the Corsini collection in Florence showing Christ crucified. Importantly, Bellini suppressed any hint of narrative, and he even eliminated Antonello's two choric figures of the Virgin and St. John, stand-ins for the viewer, cueing our response. He isolates Christ in the foreground, setting the cross on the stony plateau of Golgotha and showing him against a steely sky. The distance is framed by a rocky outcrop on the left and a steep cliff crowned by a monastery on the right, while in the distance is a seaport. It is a vast landscape traversed by paths, and we are reminded of Bembo's report, that it is Bellini's practice, as he says, to always wander at will in his paintings, so that in a like fashion they satisfy those who look at them. As in the Niccolini crucifixion, but more simply, the picture opposes the temporal world we live in with Christ's sacrifice, and it proposes a journey from the one to the other. The third event that reshaped his vision of landscape was the commissioning of a major altarpiece for the Church of San Francesco in Pesaro, which I've shown before. Pesaro is, of course, along the Adriatic coast. Bellini evidently made a trip there either to sign the contract or to inspect the place his altarpiece would occupy. And it was during this trip that he drew a number of buildings, including the Church of San Ciriaco in Ancona that we've seen in the Niccolini crucifixion. This trip was of momentous consequence, deepening his engagement with his native landscape. Clearly, he took an album with him into which he drew the sights that captured his imagination. It must have included not only drawings of buildings, but the varied, sometimes mountainous landscape of the marches, and it's in the back throne of the Pesaro coronation of the Virgin that we first get a hint of the landscape that will become the landscape of the Frick Bellini. The culmination of this experience can be read in the St. Francis. The picture is structured according to Bellini's devotional mode. A contrast is set up between the barren foreground and the distant, lush landscape, while a soft, golden light plays on the fields and the hills in the distance. The foreground is bathed in a cool light that gives the grotto a bluish cast. I don't know why this has not been commented upon more frequently, but this is the only painting by Bellini I know where the rocks have this bluish color, which is very different from what we see where the cliff drops off near the ass and the heron, which you see is in a completely different illumination. Clearly, there are two sources and two kinds of light. Bellini draws further attention to the effect by the long shadows cast by the saint, who is presented as an exemplar, his arms outspread, his head turned upwards towards the miraculous vision, his face expressing that combination of ecstasy and pain that is a hallmark of those who have experienced mystical communion with Christ. We read in the Little Flowers of St. Francis, which is the popular text I personally believe served as Bellini's point of departure, that when St. Francis beheld the seraph, he was much afraid and filled at once with joy and grief and wonder. Incidentally, an edition of the Little Flowers was printed in Venice in 1470. In Bellini's depiction, we don't require the presence of a seraph to understand what is happening, though as we have seen, there may have been one. For Bellini has included other details that make us understand that the saint's mystic experience is the climax of his devotional practice, a practice encouraged in manuals dealing with mental prayer. Beneath the cell constructed of branches, very much in accordance with some early Franciscan sources, we see a closed book. In a second stage, Bellini extended the desk at the back and added the skull so that we would understand that St. Francis has been meditating on Christ's passion, as in fact the Little Flowers tells us he did in the hours leading up to the stigmatization. We understand that his meditation has been interrupted. He has closed the book and removed his clogs in recognition that he stands on hallowed ground. As Maffeo Venier writes in his poem, the solitary and secret paths recompense those sacred feet, poor and bare, barefoot and worthy. There is a constant contrast between dormant plants and those sending forth new shoots. Perhaps most significant is the fig leaf just below the rabbit that pokes its head curiously from his burrow. These inevitably lead us to reflections on renewal and resurrection. The vine might make us think of Christ's declaration, I am the true vine and my Father is the vine dresser, or it might call forth some other text. For we are dealing with a picture conceived as a meditational aid rather than one that illustrates a fixed doctrine. The landscape, too, contains details meaningful to viewers familiar with the life of St. Francis. The ass that carried him to Mount Laverna, and the shepherd who looks towards the source of the miraculous light. It was Bellini's genius, I believe, to tap into the rich vein of nature imagery that is a hallmark of Franciscan poetry and canticles and hymns or laudi, beginning with the saint's own canticle of all created things. This was brought very powerfully to mind last February at a concert at St. Hall when I heard this Latin canticle written in France in the 13th or 14th century, perhaps about the same time as a fascinating Limoges enamel showing Francis receiving the stigmata in a standing position in the midst of a flowering garden. The canticle is titled, "In Poverty's Farm." In poverty's farm, Francis plants the vine. New production makes the shoot of the true vine grow, pulling out the thorny stem. The fig tree feeds sweetness, the thorn bushes yield to the lily. On the way he cleanses sins, pure in heart and work, that he may shine in the heavenly fatherland, free from the burden of guilt. To the pleasant pastures guide the wandering sheep, make them pursue what is useful, lift up their fallen spirits, grant they may be chosen with the grain. Now, the singing of hymns had an important place in the various scuole or confraternities of Venice, which hired professional singers and musicians to play and sing them. Precisely because they represent a vernacular, popular form of poetry, they're pertinent to our discussion. In Venice, some of the most famous were written by Leonardo Giustinian, who served on the powerful Council of Ten in Venice, but sought relief from his political duties in literature, or so he wrote to Guarino of Verona, who we have already met as a practitioner of ekphrastic poetry. Leonardo translated Petrarch's lives and composed poetry, including the most important body of hymns to have survived from the 15th century. He died in 1446. They remind us that alongside classically inspired and Petrarchan poetry, there existed a more popular religious verse relevant to our understanding of the kinds of responses Bellini anticipated. "O shining mirror," goes one, "inflamed, O valiant knight, blessed St. Francis, you have illumined the world with your humility." It has been noticed that tucked into the cord around Francis's waist is a folded piece of paper. This has been convincingly identified as the cartula, the piece of parchment on which the saint himself wrote a hymn of praise to God and his benediction to his faithful follower, Brother Leo, urging him to keep the paper with him as a talisman against temptation. Here is the piece of parchment, which is preserved as a relic in the Church of San Francesco at Assisi. On it, Francis draws a cross and a skull, which is a very sort of childlike skull, but there it is on its back, its mouth open, the cross comes out of the mouth. And this is obviously related to Bellini's depiction of the cross and skull on the lectern. It was also a reminder to someone like Giovanni Michiel that Francis had been a composer of sacred canticles and lauds. And this brings us to one of the most appealing interpretations of the Frick picture, that it shows St. Francis singing his own canticle of all created things. It's an appealing idea, but I'm afraid we really must exclude it. Yet embedded in that romantic notion is the novelty of Bellini's great painting, which is not only poetic in the way we understand the term, but in its debt to Renaissance poetics. In this picture, Bellini takes devotional painting in a new direction and lays the foundation for the mythological poesy of Giorgione and Titian. The picture Giovanni Michiel received was not a mere representation of the culminating event of St. Francis's life. It was a work that was intended to elicit both meditation and discussion among those who saw it hanging in his palace. The picture is unquestionably a landmark in the history of Venetian painting, but it also marks a turning point in the history of sensibility, whence the comparison with the poetry of Wordsworth with which I began this lecture. We can only be grateful that it is here in New York at the Frick where we can return to it again and again. Thank you so much.